Well, let us turn in our Bibles for our scripture reading tonight, which is taken from Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, and chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53. Beginning to read at verse 1. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he took our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living, for the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. If you were here a couple of weeks ago, then you may remember that we were thinking about the holiness of God. And on that occasion I mentioned some occasions throughout history when the holiness of God was obviously demonstrated. I'll just remind you of the ones I mentioned. It's not an exhaustive list by any means. But for example, it was demonstrated in Genesis 3 as God expels Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden following their disobedience. They were expelled because it was the place of God's presence. And being a holy God, he cannot tolerate or accommodate sin in his presence. We see the holiness of God demonstrated again in Exodus 20 as God gives Moses his law on Mount Sinai. We see it demonstrated throughout the book of Leviticus as the people of God have to learn that they cannot approach a holy God any way they like. If they're going to do so, then it will need to be on his terms and on the basis of sacrifice. And as I mentioned last time, chapter 10 of Leviticus records that frightening occasion when those two young priests ignored the God-given instructions and decided to do things their own way rather than his way. And what was the outcome? Leviticus 10 verse 2, so fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. And what was the explanation for that horrific event? Next verse 3, this is what the Lord spoke of when he said, among those who approach me, I will show myself whole. Those are just some of the occasions throughout history when the holiness of God has been vividly and in some cases frighteningly demonstrated. But if you were asked what you thought was the most obvious or most vivid demonstration of God's holiness throughout history, what would you say? Would you say it was the expelling of Adam and Eve from Eden? Would you say it was the giving of the law at Sinai? And would you say it was the deaths of Nadab and Abihu? Perhaps the design of the tabernacle and the temple with its most holy place, or the exile of a disobedient people to Babylon? And so we could go on. What is the clearest and most vivid demonstration of God's holiness throughout the history of our world? I want to suggest this evening that there has been a demonstration of God's holiness that surpasses any of those that I mentioned tonight. And that is the way in which the holiness of God was demonstrated at the cross. And I say that because if those Old Testament incidents that I've mentioned, if they reveal the lengths that a holy God has gone throughout history in order to separate himself from sin and sinners, the cross reveals the lengths a holy God has gone in order to be reconciled with sinners. For example, whereas in Genesis 3 the holiness of God demanded the expulsion of Adam and Eve from his presence, and the cross we see the holiness of God demanding the withdrawal of his presence from someone else. And that was his own dear Son. Do you remember some of the last words that Jesus said as he hung upon the cross? Matthew tells us in chapter 27 of his Gospel that from the 6th hour until the 9th hour darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, my God, why have you forsaken me? From all eternity, God the Father and the Son had enjoyed perfect and intimate and beautiful fellowship with one another. And even during his time on this earth, Jesus continued to know fellowship with his Father. For example, not long before going to the cross, he was able to spend time in Gethsemane's garden praying to the Father, repeatedly addressing him as my Father. But during those 3 hours of darkness, that sense of intimacy with his heavenly Father has gone, and it has been replaced instead with a horrible sense of God forsakenness. And why? Well, if you can remember back to a previous communion service, and I am going back quite a while, you may remember that we looked at the closing verse of 2 Corinthians 5, which says this: God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Did you hear that? God made him who had no sin to be sin. And as I explained on that previous occasion, that doesn't mean that Jesus actually sinned. Instead, what it means is that my sin wasn't imputed to Jesus. My sin and its guilt were credited to his name, to his account, and on the cross God deals with Jesus as if he is the one who is responsible and therefore guilty for my sin. At the cross God deals with his Son as if he was the sinner rather than me. And just as God in his holiness expelled the sinner from his presence in the Garden of Eden, so God in his holiness withdraws his presence from the one who is suffering as the sinner on the cross. It is the holiness of God that explains that cry of abandonment, that cry of dereliction, that cry of God forsakenness that came from the lips of Jesus as he died for our sins. Back in Leviticus 10, we see the holiness of God demanding the death of two young disobedient priests, Nadab and Abihu. Whereas at the cross we see the holiness of God demanding the death of his young, perfectly obedient son. And why? Well, once again, the explanation is to be found in that verse from 2 Corinthians 5, which says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. At the cross, God deals with Jesus as if he is the one who is responsible and therefore guilty for my sin. And just as God in his holiness demands that Nadab and Abihu suffer the fatal consequences of their sin, so God in his holiness demands that Jesus suffers the fatal consequences of my sin. Just as God in his holiness poured out his wrath upon those two young priests for their disobedience, so God in his holiness pours out his wrath upon his own dear Son for my disobedience. Do you see the length the Holy God has gone to in order to reconcile sinners to himself? He has gone to the length of treating his own dear Son in the same way that he has treated rebellious, disobedient sinners down throughout history. If that were you or I or anyone else in this world, do you know what we would do? The demands would be done away with. The standards would be lowered in order to spare our own dear Son. But God is not like that. He's not like us. His holiness is a perfect and a perfectly consistent holiness. His holiness means that he is utterly pure and perfect without any sin or evil. His holiness is expressed in his abhorrence and punishment and separation from anything that is sinful or evil. And what you see at the cross, I would argue, is the greatest of all demonstrations of God's holiness for the simple reason that what you see at the cross is the holiness of God being perfectly expressed and consistently demonstrated and frighteningly applied, even when the person experiencing the effects of his holiness is his own dear Son. Having made him who had no sin to be sin for us, a holy God consistently expresses his holiness towards sin and towards the one being treated as a sinner, as he withdraws his presence from him and punishes him in our place. And just as the angels covered their faces because they could not gaze at the manifestation of God's holiness in Isaiah 6. So God covers the earth in darkness for those 3 years, because we could not gaze at the manifestation of God's holiness at the cross. And is it any coincidence that it is the very prophet who had that glimpse of God's holiness recorded for us in chapter 6? Is it a coincidence that he is the very one who perhaps more clearly than any other Old Testament writer describes the demonstration of God's holiness and the implications of that holiness for Jesus in his death? Right in chapter 53 of his prophecy, Isaiah says this, verse 3, he says he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Yes, in his death, Jesus was experiencing the rejection of men, and a very real part of his suffering was the pain that they in their cruelty inflicted on him. But rather than leaving the description of the Messiah's suffering in terms of how men treated him, Isaiah goes on to describe how God treated him. Verse 4, surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. You see, prior to sinners like you and I ever known peace with the Holy God, the holiness of God demands that our sin be punished and be punished by God. And says Isaiah, that is precisely what is happening at the cross. Verse 6, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And having laid our iniquities on Jesus, God in his holiness proceeded to punish Jesus as if he were the one responsible for those iniquities. And in doing so, verse 10, he was making his life a guilt offering. Amongst the many sacrifices of the Old Testament era, the guilt offering was one of those which involved the sacrificial death of an animal. It was made because of sin and the guilt which sin brings, and it resulted in atonement or at one. It resulted in the restoration of the sinner and the holy God. And that says Isaiah in verse 10 is the purpose for which God punishes his Son upon the cross. In his death, Jesus is dying as the full and the final guilt offering to which all the other guilt offerings of the Old Testament era were pointing forward to. And as a consequence of Jesus becoming that perfect and that final guilt offering, verse 11, the many will be justified. That is why we're here tonight. Because Jesus has taken the punishment that our sins deserved. Our guilt before a holy God is removed on a just basis. And therefore a holy God can justify and justly declare us to be not guilty. And so the great news of the Christian gospel is that even in the forgiving and justifying of guilty sinners like us, the holiness of God is perfectly maintained. The holiness of God is consistently expressed. The perfectly consistent holiness of God means that it could never be anything otherwise. And therefore we break bread tonight with the great assurance that our salvation is not due to a compromise of God's holiness, but rather due to a consistent outworking and vivid expression of God's holiness. It is because there was a time when Jesus was forsaken by his Father and suffered his holy wrath, that those of us who are trusting in the death of Jesus tonight can come before a holy God and address him as our Father. It's because Jesus experienced that forsakenness on the cross, that you and I, as those who are trusting in him, never need to fear that same God forsakenness throughout eternity. We're going to sing our next hymn is the hymn on the screen, and its words that are based on Isaiah 33. He was pierced for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities, and to bring us peace he was punished, and by his stripes we are healed. And after we've sung this hymn, we'll have a time of prayer to remember our Lord, to give thanks for him, for his death in our place, and do feel free to take part, and if someone would like to lead us in that, then I'll close it when appropriate. Stand to sing. He was pierced for our transgressions.